History and Culture podcasts are a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to PCN's History and Culture podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. This podcast series features interviews exploring Pennsylvania's rich history from the colonial era to industrialization, the Gettysburg Campaign to sports history, and from art to politics and more.
I'm here with Jane Calvert, founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson's Writings Project. Now, when did John Dickinson's political career begin?
So John Dickinson was born in Maryland, raised in what is now Delaware, and got his initial legal training in Philadelphia, and then he went to London for further training there. And he came back in 1757, and his legal career began in 1759 when he was elected to the legislature of what was called the Three Lower Counties on Delaware, which is now the state of Delaware, but at the time was the Three Lower Counties of Pennsylvania.
Now, John was a Quaker. How did that impact his political outlook?
John Dickinson was not a Quaker, and that's a common misconception. He was raised as a Quaker in a Quaker family. Both of his parents were Quaker, and he lived and worked in the Quaker environment of Philadelphia. He eventually married a Quaker, and one of his daughters was a Quaker, and the other one was, like him, a fellow traveler. That's what Quakers call people who aren't actually official members, but believe a lot of what Quakers believe in. And so he really agreed with them on most points of theology and politics. What made him not a Quaker was that he believed in what he said was the lawfulness of defensive war. So in other words, God would allow people to defend themselves, or a people to defend itself if it were attacked. And so he was a strong proponent of citizen militias. And in fact, he served in both the Pennsylvania militia and the Delaware militia during the Revolution.
And one of his prevalent works is the Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Do you mind discussing that a bit?
Yes, this was the document that made him into a celebrity. And I use that word intentionally because he became the most famous American, not just in the colonies, but in Europe and England as well. And he had fans, he had haters, he had trolls, he had people who really idolized him and imitated him. And the series of 12 letters published in the newspapers starting in 1767 and into 1768 were basically to resist the Townshend Acts that had recently been passed or were about to be passed. And these letters were really crucial because they not only told Americans about their rights and how to resist peacefully any encroachment on those rights by the government, they also taught Americans what it meant to be an American and how to behave as an American. And so this was a new idea, because until this time, Americans saw themselves as Britons. They were British. They were under the British government, and they didn't really see that they were connected amongst themselves. And so these letters really were, kind of an awakening for Americans, and made him so widely beloved.
And one of the big issues during this time was taxes and tax policies. What challenges were the average Americans facing?
Well, they were significant, and Dickinson was in a good position to understand these problems. So he served in the Pennsylvania legislature at this time, and or he had served, during the course of the 1770s, 60s, I should say, and and he also in his law practice represented a lot of Americans who were not very well off. And so these taxes, he saw, were going to be a huge burden on ordinary people, that they wouldn't necessarily be able to pay them, and they would fall most heavily on Americans of little means, especially for those people who had to pay for contracts to be written up, and if stamped paper were taxed, that would cost them a lot of money. And he very strongly believed in the fact that those who have the most money should be taxed more than the people who had less money. It was an equity issue as far as he was concerned. And also the most important thing was that they were being taxed by Parliament to raise a revenue when they weren't represented in Parliament. So that was taxation without representation, taxation without consent, and it was opposed to the British Constitution.
And Dickinson was a big part in the writing process of these different foundations, like the Stamp Act crisis. Was those writings specifically from him?
Well, there were two different categories of writing. One were the official writings, so he was sort of the nominal leader of the Stamp Act Congress, and so he wasn't the president, but he came prepared to the Stamp Act Congress in New York in 1765, and he'd come prepared with draft documents, and so those documents, he worked on them and they became the final documents. So that was the Declaration of the Stamp Act Congress and the petition to the King from the Stamp Act Congress. So those were the ones he wrote in his official capacity, but then he also wrote as a private citizen. And so from 1765 on, he wrote hundreds of documents to other Americans, to the king, to people in Britain. He just never stopped writing, and by my guess, he wrote somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 documents over the course of his career for the American cause, more than any other founder. And so, and sometimes he did so pseudonymously, so with a pen name, or he did so anonymously. And so it's difficult for Americans now to tell exactly what he wrote because sometimes his name wasn't even on them.
In this digital age, I feel like a lot of people don't feel the impact of writings. During this time, that's how everyone got their information. So how often would people get their hands on his writings?
Well, of course, it depended on how often he published them, but he was always writing essays that were published in the newspapers or pamphlets. His first famous writing was actually a speech he gave in the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1764, and he wasn't planning on publishing it, but some other people published it, and that became a very well-known document. And but it would take him, weeks or sometimes months to write these important documents because he was kind of a perfectionist and wanted it to be right.
Were any of his writings seen as radical?
Absolutely. In fact, one in particular that he wrote against the Stamp Act in 1766, he had the audacity, the radicalism, so to speak, to actually talk about natural rights as something that all people had that came from God. Now, this was seen as radical because more conservative-minded Britons, including Americans, believed that the rights that people possessed came by virtue of their being English, and it was not something from God. It was from the British Constitution, and so his saying this struck a lot of people as radical and inflammatory. But then, of course, later on, more Americans picked up on this until we see the most famous statement in the Declaration of Independence.
And as his career bloomed and he really gained a voice, he got involved with the Continental Congress. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, he didn't just get involved with it, he made it possible. It would not have been held in Philadelphia if he hadn't masterfully kind of manipulated the competing and hostile factions in Pennsylvania, and he was the only individual that they all trusted on all sides of the political spectrum. So the conservative Quakers on the one hand, and the radical mechanics and laborers on the other hand, but they all trusted him, and so he was able to kind of manipulate and get them all to agree that the Continental Congress, the first one in 1774, should be held in Philadelphia. And it was so controversial that he actually had to, he proposed what became kind of a shadow government to bypass the conservative Quaker government, and set up committees and basically a government to kind of bypass the official one. But then his enemies in the official assembly actually did not want him in the Congress, and so they did not send him as a delegate. And so for the first few weeks of the first Congress, he wasn't actually sitting, but he still wrote 4 out of the 6 documents that body produced. He was basically its consultant from the outside until he did finally take his seat. But that Congress and the second Congress, he dominated. He was the leader of both of those Congresses, and they followed the directives for what he wanted, which was resistance, peaceful resistance to the British government, and to attempt reconciliation.
Now, why did his enemies try to push him out of Congress? What was their real reason for not wanting him present?
Well, so those were, it goes back to the beginning of his career. He had a habit of taking very strong stances based on what his conscience dictated, and he would stand up for what he thought was right, no matter who he angered. And so he angered some powerful people in Pennsylvania beginning as early as 1758, and then he continued to anger some of those same people, one of whom was Benjamin Franklin, who didn't play a role in that first Congress. And another one was a guy named Joseph Galloway. Joseph Galloway was someone who, he and Dickinson, there was no love lost between them, and they even at one point got into a fist fight over political matters. And so Joseph Galloway was the one who just was very, very jealous of Dickinson and did not want anything to do with resistance to Britain, and so he was the one who kept Dickinson out of the first Congress.
And during this time, all of Dickinson's writings are about revolution, standing up for yourself. But one writing that everyone seems to remember is the Declaration of Independence. And what was his opinion on that?
Well, so Dickinson's writings were actually not in favor of revolution. He was never in favor of revolution. He thought that the conflict with Britain could be solved through peaceful protest and peaceful means. And actually, he was right about that. And Americans actually had great success in getting the offending acts repealed through peaceful means. Why Dickinson didn't want independence and revolution was mainly because he thought America wasn't prepared, but more pressingly, he was afraid that if America declared independence, the Quakers would lose their constitution in Pennsylvania that provided for their religious liberty, and that's what he was very concerned about. And so he wasn't opposed to independence per se. He was opposed to a violent break. So he thought it could happen slowly and gradually without bloodshed. And so his whole goal was, preserving American liberties, which he thought would be better protected under the British Constitution, and preventing bloodshed. So that's what he tried to do. But when it became clear that Americans had decided, or at least Congress, because all Americans were not in favor of independence, but Congress had decided it would declare independence, after he gave his final speech against it, he did one of the most patriotic things of the American Revolution, which was he put aside his own selfish interests and his own concerns, and he joined his battalion and went off to the front to meet the British. So he threw everything he had behind the American cause to make sure that it was going to succeed.
And along with that, unity was a big part. He wanted the whole country to sort of step together.
Yes.
And one of the things he did to further that idea was to abstain from signing the Declaration of Independence. Do you mind going into detail on why that was an important decision for him?
Right. So that's exactly right. He believed that unity was American salvation, that whatever happened, they had to remain unified. So in the Farmer's Letters, he started talking about this, and it caused Massachusetts to write the famous circular letter that got all the colonies together in a non-importation agreement. But then, as the Declaration of Independence seemed likely, he wanted, if it was going to be declared, he wanted it to be unanimous. So that's why he abstained from the vote, so as not to have a no vote on record. And then, but then he still did not believe it was the right thing to do, so he refused to sign it, not looking to protect any of his own interests, just in order to register, that this was not what he thought was best for America. But it was that imperative of unity that led him to abstain from the vote.
And what was the result of this action compared to the other people who proceeded with the document?
Well, not much, really. Americans, there were some Americans certainly who were disappointed that he didn't vote or sign the Declaration of Independence. But there were other Americans who didn't either. And for the most part, nobody really cared very much. And the fact that he joined the cause was more or less all they wanted. It was really only his political enemies in Pennsylvania. And at this time, his political enemies were no longer the people like Joseph Galloway, who had fled and gone over to the British. It was the radicals. And the radicals basically had, they had written a new constitution. It did not protect religious liberty and the rights of dissenters, either political dissenters or religious dissenters. And Dickinson wanted this to be changed. And when the government would not change the Constitution, Dickinson left the Assembly and basically caused the Pennsylvania government to collapse. At that point, or at least the Assembly to collapse. And at that point, the Pennsylvania government began to pursue Dickinson as an enemy of the state. And that's when they started complaining that he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. And, but it was contrived, and it wasn't really anything that they cared that much about. And for the most part, none of the other leading founders really cared about it either.
Was Dickinson's reputation ever clearly destroyed? He still was an active member.
Yes, and his reputation during his lifetime remained intact. He did not stop serving America after he returned from the front. In fact, he was voted right into the Pennsylvania Assembly. Then he abdicated his seat there. He joined the Delaware militia as a private, which no gentleman did at the time. And then he went on to serve in so many capacities. He held more offices in America than any other founding father. And among these he was the president of Delaware, president of Pennsylvania. He was the chairman of the Annapolis Convention in 1786. He was a pivotal member of the Federal Convention in 1787. Then he was the president of the Delaware Constitutional Convention in 1791 and 92. And even after he retired and became a very active philanthropist, he still led citizens groups, and there were people through the rest of his life clamoring for him to stand for office again. And so during his lifetime, he remained a celebrity, and to the point that when he died, the papers around the states were filled with eulogies and just all manner of tributes, and really second only to George Washington and possibly Benjamin Franklin, but that's a little bit more complicated. But yes, Dickinson's legacy, or at least his reputation while he was alive, remained really solid.
And even though Dickinson had an issue with the revolution part of the Declaration of Independence, he really followed another phrase, which is all men are created equal. How did he proceed to push those ideals into American society?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. He did not want a rupture and a revolution, but he was really the only one of the leading figures of the time who took the principles of the Declaration of Independence to heart and acted on them. So one of the first things he tried to do, even before the Declaration of Independence was issued, was he tried in his draft of the Articles of Confederation, which he wrote in June of 1776, he tried to get protection for women's rights written into the Articles of Confederation. Americans weren't having, they didn't want either religious liberty in the Articles of Confederation, and certainly not women's rights protected. So that was one way. The other way was at his first opportunity, as soon as he went back home after his service in the Pennsylvania militia in 1777, he began the process of freeing all of the black people he enslaved. And so he first manumitted them provisionally, and then over the next 10 years, he manumitted them all unconditionally. So by 1786, he no longer was a slave owner, and he started trying to abolish slavery in Delaware, and he spoke out against slavery in the Federal Convention and at other points. He was unsuccessful in all of these endeavors, but at least he freed the people he enslaved and made sure that they were provided for afterwards.
Now, Dickinson has just a really beautiful history, but a lot of times people only remember him as the man who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. Why do you think that is?
It's clear why that is. He, as I said, his legacy was intact, his reputation during his lifetime and his legacy until we get to the time period, the antebellum period, in the sort of the 1830s, 40s, when a historian named George Bancroft wrote the first multi-volume history of the American history and of the Revolution. And when he wrote that history, he was a New Englander. He saw John Adams as the hero, and he didn't like Dickinson, and he didn't like Quakers, and so he turned Dickinson into a villain. And the things that he wrote about Dickinson in this book, it almost like he had a personal vendetta against Dickinson, and he accused him of being a coward and a loyalist and effeminate, and just really ripped him apart. And at that point, Americans sort of stopped considering Dickinson a founder, and we can see that same thesis, Bancroft's interpretation of Dickinson, we can see that echoed in modern day histories. So we see it in David McCullough's John Adams and in the HBO miniseries based on that book, and you can see it even among well-respected historians. They adopt this really kind of warped interpretation of Dickinson that is based on George Bancroft, who based his work on John Adams, who was Dickinson's other major political enemy.
What can you tell me about the John Dickinson Writings Project?
The John Dickinson Writings Project is a documentary editing project that I founded in 2010 in order to collect and transcribe and publish everything Dickinson wrote on public affairs over the course of his life. So we collect images of his writings, then we transcribe them and annotate them to give them historical context and publish them. And we have published volumes 1 through 3. Volume 4 comes out in February of this year, 2026. And we are almost done with Volume 5, and we are making good progress on Volume 6, which will take us up through 1777. And so what we're uncovering are just amazing documents that show Dickinson much more active and assertive than any history has indicated so far. And the documents that we're uncovering and publishing are actually changing the narrative of the American Revolution to show Dickinson at the center of the activity at every single turn. So, and these sources are things that historians have never used because they were unable to read them. and they're just I mean, really every day we're uncovering new documents. The difficulty is that we are dependent on federal funds to operate. Documentary editing is a very labor-intensive and expensive endeavor, and we recently lost our federal funding, and so it's unclear whether the project is actually going to survive, and it could be that that Volume 5 is our last volume if we don't get further funding.
And Volume 1 through 4, what has been the most unique discovery you've made while going through all his writings?
Well, I think I would say, well, there's so many, it's hard to choose. In the earlier writings, we uncovered a series of documents that concerned a libel trial of a man in Pennsylvania, and he was put on trial by the Pennsylvania Assembly allegedly for libel. But basically this was a freedom of the press issue, and the Pennsylvania Assembly was trying to keep this man from criticizing itself. And so Dickinson was just a newly minted barrister, and yet he ended up taking the lead as defense attorney for this man. His name was William Smith, and arguing for liberty of the press and how important liberty of the press is for liberty. So that was one thing that was just really astounding. He is the earliest founder we have arguing for liberty of the press. So that was one really astounding discovery. Another one that will come, actually a couple that will come out in Volume 6 if we make it that far, will be the Religious Liberty Clause that he wrote for the Articles of Confederation that includes protections for women's rights. Until now, most historians have thought that women's rights were not a consideration for anyone during the American Revolution, but Dickinson cared about it, and he tried to get it protected. And then the other thing is a document we're still working on right now. This was also written in June of 1776, and it was what's called the Plan of Treaties, and it was basically the blueprint for American foreign policy that lasted up until World War II, and until now, historians have assumed that John Adams wrote it by himself and was the only person who worked on it, but I've found an earlier version of this in Dickinson's handwriting. But these are the most obvious documents, and there is so much else that is coming to light that just every day it's a day of discoveries.
We've been speaking with Jane Calvert, founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PCN's history and culture content, like the interview you just heard, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Explore other documentary programs, event coverage, and a lot more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNtv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.